Good afternoon, friends. I, on behalf of Beyond Law CLC and Shobhit University Meerut, welcome you all to yet another webinar so that we can have the insights of the subjects from the experts. Today we have Mr. Baljinder Sra, who has already been on the platform and shared his knowledge. His webinars have been well received, and as such, on the request of the participants, we again requested him to share his insights on reverse burden clauses and presumption of innocence. At least from the topic, I can state therein that the fact that people are asking him that he should come again, the presumption is that he's quite popular and his insights are being well received by the participants, not only on the platform, but also on the Facebook. And this is a quite fascinating subject. And as a student, as a lawyer, as a judicial officer, one always intends what is the scope of this new facet of law which is evolving with the flux of time. Mr. Baljinder Sra is an additional district judge. He's a member faculty of the Chandigarh Judicial Academy. He had taught during the Punjab Superior Judicial Exams, which also shows that his in-depth knowledge towards the subject gave the flip of topping the examination. And as a lawyer, when he was practicing the Punjab Haryana High Court, I've closely seen him that as a lawyer also, he had an edge from large number of people, and which made him different. And he has written 6 books, which have already stands approved, and they are likely to come within the market shortly. We wish him all the best for those books and all the success for that book, because we are quite sacrosanct that the insights given from those books will help each and everyone. Over to you, Mr. Sra.
Thank you, Vikas. Thank you so much. First of all, I thank again Mr. Vikas Chatrat as well as Beyond Law CLC for giving me this opportunity to interact again for the 3rd time on a new topic of law, which is indeed very interesting. When Mr. Vikas was asking me to choose a topic, so I thought that since this topic is of quite interest as well as use to the lawyers as well as judicial officers and the law students, I will make an attempt to share my views on this topic. Now, the topic of today's deliberation is reverse burden clauses and presumption of innocence.
Mr. Sra, you can slightly move towards the left. You're not in the center of the screen. Yeah.
I can just adjust the computer. Is it okay now?
Yes, it's fine.
All right, thank you. Now let us first understand that what do we understand by the term presumption of innocence? In simple term, presumption of innocence means first that an accused is innocent until proven guilty in accordance with established procedure. And second, that the prosecution shall establish the guilt of the accused beyond reasonable doubt. Now, this principle of presumption of innocence is a hallowed principle in the criminal law. It is integral or central to the principle of fairness, protection of liberty and human dignity. Any society which ensures fairness and social justice will have this principle in the administration of its criminal law. Now, not only this principle which has evolved from the common law, it finds mention in almost all the international instruments on human rights. This principle stands incorporated in Article 11, Section 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Then in Article 14, Section 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966. Then in Article 6, Section 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, 53. Apart from that, the Section 3 of the Human Rights Act of 1998 of the UK, it also contains a provision that the primary and the subordinate legislation in UK will be given effect to subject to the convention rights, that is incompatibility with the convention rights. Now, so far as India is concerned, we do not have any statutory provision where we find that this principle has been incorporated. Though in the administration of criminal law, we have been often applying this principle day in, day out. Now, the Supreme Court in various judgments has held that so far as this principle of innocence is concerned, it is not a fundamental right. So it has not been elevated because it is not specifically articulated in any of the article of the Constitution. And even in the unarticulated right, it has not been elevated to the level of a fundamental right. It has been held to be a human right. I can say that so far as the rule of law is concerned, or the concept of fair trial is concerned, these unarticulated rights have been taken to be the part of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. But so far as the principle of innocence is concerned, this has not been held to be one of the fundamental rights. So the implication of this is that as and when there is a reverse burden clause in any statutory provision, then the same cannot be challenged simply on the ground that it is in violation of the fundamental right. Now, there is another maxim of the English law that let the 10 guilty men be acquitted, but not a single man should be wrongly convicted. This is another facet of this very principle of presumption of innocence. The implication of this principle is that the prosecution must prove each and every ingredient of the offense, and the standard of proving these ingredients would be beyond reasonable doubt, which is of a higher nature. Now, the accused need not answer or respond to the case of the prosecution unless these two parameters are met. But then this principle is not without exception. There are certain statutory exceptions which we conventionally find even in the IPC as well as the Indian Evidence Act. We have Chapter 4 under the IPC incorporating the general exceptions. And Section 105 of the Indian Evidence Act says that the burden to prove these exceptions or even these special exceptions or the proviso shall be on the accused. But the standard which has been cast upon the accused is of a lighter nature. That is, the accused can either prove on the preponderance of probability standard, which we apply in civil cases, or he can even cast a reasonable doubt. So if he is able to show that his case falls under any of these exception on these parameters, then he can seek the acquittal, irrespective of the fact that prosecution has been able to discharge its initial burden. Now, reverse burden clause in simple term implies that where a statute cast a burden on the accused to prove either some ingredient of the offense or some defensive facts which will entitle him to seek the acquittal. Now we can take few examples that how these reverse burden clauses can take different shapes. Now, in a given situation, an offense would constitute of different facts. It may so happen that out of these constituent facts of the offense, certain facts are required to be proved by the prosecution and certain other facts are presumed in favor of the prosecution. So the burden to disprove those facts which are presumed shall lie upon the accused. The second situation could be that, like conventionally, an offense consists of two major elements, that is actus reus, the physical act, and the mens rea part. So in a given situation, the statute may impose or presume the mental culpability or the mens rea part on the accused in favor of the prosecution and cast the burden on the accused to disprove the same. The third situation could be that where so far as the ingredient of the offense plus the mens rea part, it is for the prosecution to prove, but it lays down certain defenses or we can say facts which will entitle the accused to acquittal. So the burden may be cast upon the accused to prove these defenses and all that, which I have said that conventionally we have this mechanism under the IPC plus the Indian Evidence Act. Similarly, under the Indian Evidence Act, we have certain sections like section 113A, which relates to the presumption with regard to the abetment to the suicide of a married woman, which is a permissive presumption. Then we have 113B, presumption as to dowry death. And then we have section 114A also relating to the consent part in case of sexual assault cases. So therefore, legislature can adopt different kind of mechanism to presume certain facts in a given situation and cast the burden upon the accused or reverse the burden upon the accused to disprove those facts. Now, next important question which comes to our mind is that how the accused can disprove these presumed facts. What is the standard of proof which can be employed to disprove these facts? Now, if we go by the statutory provision under the NDPS Act, under the Prevention of Corruption Act, Negotiable Instrument Act, and the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, we'll find that different type of standard of burden have been cast upon the accused. I'll take this a little later in detail. But as of now, I wanted to just give the broad perspective regarding the reverse burden clause, what it means. Now, if we say these presumption or the reverse burden clauses and the burden of proof, let us understand what is the correlation between these two facets. We often say that these are two sides of the same coin. Whenever a law casts a burden to prove certain facts on a certain party, then there is a presumption regarding its non-existence in favor of the opposite party. Similarly, if the law says that there are certain facts which are to be presumed, then the burden is reversed upon the opposite party to disprove the existence of those facts. Now, presumption further can be based upon certain foundational fact, or they can be based upon without any proof on the foundational facts. Now, where they're based upon certain basic facts or basic fact presumption, what we call as that the prosecution is required to prove certain basic or foundational facts, and then the other facts which flow rationally and naturally from those proved facts, those are presumed, and the burden is reversed upon the opposite party to disprove the same. Now, there are three different modes by which the rebuttable presumption can be disproved. One is the party can cast a reasonable doubt regarding those facts, and then he has discharged the burden, like in situations where there is the general exceptions or right to private defense. If the accused is able to cast a reasonable doubt in the case of the prosecution, then he is definitely entitled to the benefit of doubt. The second mode is that he is required to lead, or there is an evidentiary burden upon him to adduce evidence to show that the given fact is non-existent or is false or is not true. And the third mode is that is of persuasive or legal burden cast upon the accused to disprove a given fact on the standard of preponderance of probability. Now, when we will examine this principle in the light of the statutory provision under the NDPS Act or under the POCSO, we will come across that the standard employed in our legislative mechanism is beyond reasonable doubt. But before that, let us examine that what are the constitutional limits within which these reverse burden clauses can be upheld or can be sustained. And what are the reasons in which these reverse burden clauses can be adhered to, or we can have these in the legislative mechanism. Now, one of the areas where this presumption or reverse burdens are raised is in respect of proof of negative facts. We have the example of all the licensing acts, like NDPS Act. The possession of the contraband is itself prohibited under Section 8 of the Act. And if anybody is authorized by way of a license or any other authorization, then the burden is cast upon that person to show the authorization or the license. Second area is that where the particular fact is within the special knowledge of the accused. Now here we have, we come across different kind of statutory provision. Now in offences, we can take a few cases also on the point. In offences where the purpose of doing an act by the accused is also one of the constituent element of the offence, and the act itself is prohibited, then the burden to show the purpose can be cast upon the accused. Here we can take two test cases. One is the case under the Drug Law Act of the Singapore, and one is the Canadian case under the Narcotic Control Act of Canada. Now, in the Canadian case, that is R versus Oakes, there the provision provided that if a person is found in possession of narcotic, then the burden is cast upon him to show that the possession was not meant for trafficking. Otherwise, the law shall presume that the possession of the narcotic was meant for trafficking, howsoever insignificant the quantity of the contraband may be. And this burden has to be discharged by the accused. Now, when this, it was Section 8 of the Act which provided this reverse burden clause, and when this provision was challenged before the Canadian court, it held that it is unconstitutional. Now, for that matter, so far as Canada is concerned, it had Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and Section 11D of this charter incorporates the presumption of innocence as one of the fundamental right or freedom under its charter. And therefore, the court held that there were twofold tests which was laid down. One was that there must be a rational connection between the fact which is to be proved by the prosecution and fact which is to be presumed. Now here in this case, this test was missing. The provision did not satisfy this test, because if a person is found in possession of a contraband, howsoever insignificant the quantity may be, then it cannot be presumed that this contraband was meant for the purpose of trafficking. So this presumed fact does not flow naturally or rationally from the proved fact. The proved fact was the possession of the contraband, and the presumed fact was that it was meant for trafficking, and the burden to disprove this was cast upon the accused. Now we will compare this with the Singapore case. The Singapore case is Ong Ek Chuan versus public prosecutor. This is of 1980. Now here, the facts were of a similar nature. The only difference was that the law provided that if a person is found in possession of a quantity of a certain limit, beyond the limit, only then the presumption will be raised regarding the trafficking part. Now we can compare this under our own law also. Now let us suppose that under the NDPS Act, we have the segregation between a small quantity, intermediate quantity, and commercial quantity. And somebody, if the law says that if somebody is found in possession of a quantity greater than the commercial quantity or of the commercial quantity, then the presumption can be raised that the contraband was meant for trafficking. Then we can definitely say that here the fact which is presumed rationally flows from the proved fact. So in this Singapore case, the court upheld the statutory provision in the similar, which was cast in similar fashion, except for the point that there the threshold limit was fixed by the legislature, beyond which this presumption was to be raised and reverse burden was to be cast upon the accused. Now the third situation, a situation in which the reverse burden can be cast, is the comparative hardship in proving a given fact. Now in a situation that where it is virtually impossible for the prosecution to prove a given fact, and it is comparatively easier for the accused to prove that fact because it may be specially within his knowledge, and there is no inconvenience cast upon the accused to prove that fact. In these situations also, the law may cast the reverse burden upon the accused. Now, one of the important provision under the Indian Evidence Act we have is 106, that the fact which is especially within the knowledge of the person, the burden to prove that fact will be upon that person. So here also, under the reverse burden clauses in the statutory offences, the legislature may adopt such kind of a mechanism where it may cast a reverse burden upon the accused to prove or disprove the fact which is especially within his or her knowledge. Now, having said this, let us see what are the tests which have been evolved by the courts in India to test the validity of this reverse burden clauses. Now, I'll make a couple of points on this. First point is that the courts in India, the constitutional courts in India, have categorically held that the presumption of innocence is not a fundamental right, it is only a human right. Two, reverse burdens are neither unreasonable nor arbitrary, and they do not violate Article 21 of the Constitution of India. Three, that these reverse burden can be held to be arbitrary only in certain situations where they will affect the right of fair trial, which is one of the facets of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. I came across one case of the division bench of the Bombay High Court, that is Sheikh Zahid Mukhtar versus State of Maharashtra, 2017, Volume 2, AR Bombay, page 140, where the division bench has evolved certain tests for sustaining the constitutionality of these reverse burden clauses in India. Now, the first test which has been laid down is that is the state required to prove enough basic or essential facts constituting the crime so as to raise a presumption regarding the balance fact, and whether there is a probative connection between the proved fact and the presumed fact. The second test is, does the proof of this balance fact involve a burden to prove a negative fact? Third test is, are these balance facts within the special knowledge of the accused? And the fourth test is that does this burden, considering the relative ease of proving or discharging this burden on the part of the accused, subject the accused to any hardship or operation or inconvenience? Now, these tests have been taken from different judicial pronouncement in different foreign jurisprudence or jurisdiction, and these tests have been laid down in this case by the division bench. Now, when we examine these reverse burden clauses on the anvil of these tests, under the fourth statutory provision which I have just stated, we will find that the judicial pronouncement on these statutory provision are not consistent and in consonance with these parameters. Now, let us first take the example of NDPS Act. There we have two provisions which relates to reverse burden clauses, that is section 35 and 54 of the Act. 35 says that that wherever the mens rea is the part of the offense or is requirement under the provision of the Act, then it shall be presumed and the burden shall be upon the accused to disprove it. That is one. But the novel feature of this provision is that the standard of proof required to disprove this fact on the accused is beyond reasonable doubt, which is of a very, very higher nature. Similarly, section 54 says that on the proof of certain foundational fact by the prosecution, the court may raise the presumption regarding the commission of the offense. Now, what are these foundational facts? Foundational fact is that if the prosecution is able to show or prove the possession of any contraband. Second, the prosecution is able to show the possession of any land on which the contraband was being cultivated. 3, possession of any apparatus specially designed or any group of utensils which is specially adopted for the manufacture of any contraband. 4th, possession of any material which have undergone any process towards the manufacturing of the contraband, or even any residue left from the material from which the contraband could have been manufactured. So therefore, if the prosecution is able to prove the possession of any of this foundational fact, then section 54 says the court may raise the presumption regarding the commission of the offense unless and until the contrary is proved by the prosecution, by the accused, or the possession is satisfactorily explained for by the accused. Now, so far as these two terms are concerned, that is satisfactorily accounted for, unless and until contrary is proved. This phrase we will find in the NDPS Act, we will find in the Prevention of Corruption Act also. The constitutional courts have held that these phrases mean that the accused is going to discharge the burden on the anvil of preponderance of probability. So therefore, he cannot get away with the offense by raising a reasonable doubt. The standard is a bit of a higher nature. Like earlier I said that these rebuttable presumption can be rebutted in 3 different ways. One is he can raise a reasonable doubt regarding the presumed fact. Second, evidentiary burden can be cast upon him, whereby he's required to adduce sufficient evidence to show the truth or untruth regarding the presumed fact. And third is a legal or a persuasive burden based upon the angle of preponderance of probability to prove or disprove a given fact. So therefore, the burden cast upon the accused under this act is of a higher nature. Now, when the constitutional validity of these provisions was challenged before the Honorable Apex Court in Noor Agha case, now there the Honorable Apex Court, while interpreting these provisions, it laid down certain parameters and principle for the triggering or attraction of these reverse burden clauses. Now, it categorically held that in order to attract the presumption or this reverse burden clause, the prosecution must prove the foundational fact, that is the possession, which I have already highlighted, that possession of the contraband or any apparatus or any material or any other paraphernalia beyond reasonable doubt. Second, the proof of possession has to be established by showing that the search and seizure was conducted in accordance with the provision of the act. Now, when we examine the provision of the act, how practically these principles would be applicable? If we examine the NDPS Act, we will find that the courts have categorized or divided all the procedural prescriptions into two different categories. That is mandatory and non-mandatory. In the mandatory category, one example is Section 50. Now, if the search and seizure was conducted in violation of the mandatory provision under the NDPS Act, then the reverse burden clause will not be operative. Then these presumption cannot come into picture, cannot be taken aid of by the prosecution. Because if the search is illegal, then that piece of evidence has to be eschewed from consideration. It cannot be even taken into consideration. But let us say the prosecution is able to prove the factum of possession of provision. In such situation, the court may raise the presumption under Section 54. Now, another important aspect is Section 35. That is how to disprove the mental culpability part or the mens rea part of the, which has been raised in favor of the prosecution. Now, in the provision, the wording employed is that the accused can disprove this fact on the anvil of beyond reasonable doubt, which is of a higher nature. Now, this provision in some of the cases before the Honorable Apex Court, when it came for interpretation, this was misconstrued. I'll also give a few cases, a list of cases also, where this Section 35 was misconstrued. The misconstruction was that the Honorable Apex Court was of the opinion that this proof of mens rea rests upon the prosecution. And therefore, the prosecution is required to prove the mens rea part beyond reasonable doubt. Whereas it is not so. Rather, Section 35 states that mens rea is to be presumed on the part of the accused, and it is for the accused to rebut it on the anvil of beyond reasonable doubt. Now, subsequent to Noor Agha case, if we examine certain other cases, I can give the citation also of the Apex Court, where we find that there is no coherent approach subsequent to the Noor Agha case. Now, in Mohanlal versus State of Punjab, AER 2018 Supreme Court 3853, the Honorable Apex Court relied upon the Noor Agha case, but while construing these reverse burden clauses, it held that in order to trigger the reverse burden clauses, the prosecution is required to establish a prima facie case beyond reasonable doubt after investigation. Now it lowered the burden of proof upon the prosecution. Whereas in Noor Agha case, the apex court categorically held that the factum of possession has to be established by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. And the search and seizure must be in accordance with the provision of the Act. And if there is a violation of mandatory provision, then this reverse burden clause would not get triggered and would not come handy to the prosecution. Then in Hanif Khan case, this is Hanif Khan versus Central Bureau of Narcotics, 2019, Volume 3, Apex Court Judgment, page 372. Now here the Apex Court, while construing these reverse burden clause under the NDPS Act, again lowered the threshold limit by stating that the prosecution is required to establish a prima facie case only whereafter the burden shifts to the accused. Now, prima facie case, this was never held in the Noor Agha case that the prosecution is going to prove the factum of possession on the anvil of just a prima facie case. Then there is another judgment of the Honorable Apex Court, that is Dharampal versus State of Punjab. This is 2010, Volume 9, SCC, page 608. Now here the Apex Court said that this section 54 creates a legal fiction. Whereas while reading these provisions, we find that this provision do not create any legal fiction, because there is a difference between legal fiction and presumption. Rather, the presumption under section 54 is a rebuttable presumption. The accused can bring on record the evidence to disprove the same. Now, coming to the presumption under section 20 or reverse burden clause under section 20 of the Prevention of Corruption Act. Now here also, when we examine the presumption under section 20, there are certain facts which the prosecution must prove beyond reasonable doubt. Now this fact is that the accused has attempted to obtain or obtained the illegal gratification or undue advantage as under the new act. This factum must be proved by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. Then the presumed fact under section 20 is that this undue advantage or the illegal gratification which was accepted or obtained was as a motive or reward in connection with the performance or non-performance or dishonest or improper performance of the official duty by the public servant. Now this presumed fact, that is for what purpose this was accepted, we can say is within the special knowledge of the accused, and therefore he can give evidence to disprove this fact that it was not in connection with the performance or non-performance or dishonest performance or improper performance or non-performance of the official duty. So the rational connection test under the NDPS Act as well as under the Prevention of Corruption Act is met when we examine these reverse burden clauses. But when we examine the reverse burden clause or clauses under the POCSO Act, that is Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, there we have two reverse burden clause, section 29 and 30. Now, so far as 30 is concerned, that deals with the mens rea part on the accused. It is similar to section 35 of the NDPS Act, that the mens rea on the part of the accused will be presumed. But if we examine section 29, this probably will lead to some difficulty when we interpret this provision. Section 29 says that where a person is prosecuted for committing or abetting or attempting to commit any offense under section 3579, that is penetrative sexual assault, aggravated penetrative sexual assault, or aggravated sexual assault, the special court shall presume that such person has committed or abetted or attempted to commit the offense as the case maybe unless the contrary is proved. Now this reverse burden clause is a bit problematic because it does not cast any burden upon the prosecution to prove even the foundational fact. If we give the literal interpretation to this reverse burden clause under section 29, it simply says when the person is prosecuted for committing, abetting, or attempting to commit these listed offences, the special court shall presume that he is guilty of the offence unless the contrary is proved. So this reverse burden clause is different from what we have noticed under the NDPS Act as well as under the Prevention of Corruption Act. Now we don't have many judicial precedent on the interpretation of this section 29. Some of the high courts before which this matter was raised, they have diluted or watered down the rigor of this section, this reverse burden clause under section 29. And they say that the word prosecuted does not simply mean that the moment the challan or the charge sheet is produced before the court, the special court shall raise this presumption in favor of the prosecution. It simply means that the prosecution will lead the evidence to prove the ingredient of the charged offense, though the evidence without being tested on the anvil of the principle of the Evidence Act, the court shall raise the presumption in favor of the prosecution and the burden is cast upon the accused to disprove the same. Now again, there is a policy matter for enacting these reverse burden, such kind of reverse burden clause, but the wording of the reverse burden clause, if examined on the anvil of the tests which the Bombay Division Bench of Bombay High Court has laid down, then this definitely transgresses the constitutional limits. But the courts, by way of interpretation, say that the word prosecuted is not to be equated with mere laying down of the charge sheet. Now the reason, if we examine what is the reason for this, to my mind, the reason is that where a child is sexually assaulted, a child may not be in a position to withstand the test of cross-examination just like an adult witness. Therefore, the law says that in such a situation, once the child deposes in the court, gives the evidence, then presumption must be attached to the testimony of the child that it is truthful. And therefore, the burden would be reversed upon the accused to disprove that the ingredient of the offense are not met. Now, similarly, if we examine the reverse burden clause under the Negotiable Instrument Act, we have section 139 and 118 of that act. 118 of this act raises the presumption regarding certain factors regarding validity of the negotiable instruments, that is the consideration, date of making, drawing of the negotiable instrument, time of acceptance within reasonable time, time of transfer, endorsement, stamps, and holder being holder in due course of law. Similarly, section 139, it raises a legal presumption in favor of holder of the check that he received the check in discharge of any debt or other liability. Now, initially, the Honorable Apex Court in Krishna Janardhan Bhatt case was of the view that there is no presumption that the debt or liability is illegal in nature. But these observations were not approved of in the subsequent decision of the Supreme Court, that is in Rangappa case. The citation is Rangappa versus Mohan, AIR 2010 Supreme Court, page 1898. And the citation of Krishna Janardhan Bhatt versus Dattaraya G. Hegde is 2008, volume 4, SCC page 54. So in Rangappa case, the Apex Court said that the presumption under 139 includes the presumption regarding the existence of legally enforceable debt or liability. But here the Supreme Court also laid down that so far as the reverse burden clauses are concerned, in the absence of compelling justification, the reverse onus clauses should be interpreted or should be held to impose only the evidentiary burden and not the persuasive or legal burden. But just as I've examined, shared with you, different provisions of reverse burden clauses in our statutory the statutes, we often find that the standard of proof which is provided in these provision is beyond reasonable doubt, which is of a much higher nature. So the resultant effect is that as of now, the jurisprudence in our country on these count is still evolving. Since the Honorable Apex Court has not elevated the presumption of innocence to the level of fundamental right, and it is only a human right, therefore, whenever these reverse burden clauses are challenged, then these have to be examined on the anvil of this right to fair trial, which is a component part or the unarticulated right under Article 21 of the Constitution of India. So if the reverse burden clauses are cast in such a fashion that where it will transgress the right to fair trial, in those situations, the Honorable Apex Court can definitely strike down such reverse burden clauses, but that depends upon a given situation. But as we have examined in these certain statutory provision, they have instead adopted of watering down or reading down these provision and holding that these reverse burden clauses would cast only evidential burden upon the accused, and he can disprove this presumed fact on the anvil of preponderance of probability factor. So therefore, after examining all these provision, my conclusion is that reverse burden clauses cannot be said to be per se unconstitutional. Two, these can be tested only on the anvil if they transgress the right to fair trial. Third, wherever possible, the court shall try to read down this provision to bring it within the constitutional limits and casting an evidential burden upon the accused instead of a legal burden with the standard of beyond reasonable doubt. So Mr. Vikas, probably I'm over with my presentation.
It was quite engaging session. We have a few questions. No, I have one. And in fact, Justice Kuldeep Singh had also joined, though off late he has left it.
I wish good evening. Please convey my wishes to Honorable Mr. Justice Kuldeep Singh.
Yes, because we always, his insights on such subjects are also good. So, one is question by Sameer Goel. Article 20, subclause 3 of the Constitution of India gives accused a safeguard not to show any document against him. However, under the DV and CRPC, Hindu Marriage Act 1924, while applying for interim maintenance, the accused is forced to produce assets and income documents. What is your take in this?
Now, so far as the Domestic Violence Act is concerned, or these maintenance cases are concerned, these are civil laws and not criminal statutes. Two, so far as the guarantee or right under Article 20 Clause 3 is concerned, that is available only in respect of criminal trials. So therefore, even if in such civil laws, there's a provision which casts a burden upon the accused to produce certain documents which will help the court to assess the maintenance or other rights of the parties, these will not transgress the constitutional or fundamental right under Article 20 Clause 3 of the Act or the Constitution.
Just hold on. Navneet, could you just clarify a bit on human right versus fundamental rights? You said presumption of innocence is there. Innocence is there. Is only a fundamental right. Is only a human right.
Now, so far as fundamental rights are concerned, it carries a specific meaning. We say that these rights are entrenched. When we say entrenched, it leads to two implications. One, that these rights cannot be taken away by the legislature or by the executive direction. Two, whenever there is a violation of fundamental rights, then these action or these acts can be impeached before the constitutional courts, being in violation of the fundamental rights. So therefore, a legislative enactment or an executive action can be struck down if it is in violation of fundamental right. Whereas a legislative action cannot be struck down simply on the ground that it is in violation of a human right, unless that human right has been elevated to the level of a fundamental right, or this unarticulated right is read into the ambit of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. So therefore, this is a you can say a broad difference between a human right and a fundamental right. Second, I can simply say that in case of human right, we simply say that these are the rights which every human being enjoys because of his individuality of being a human being. So legally, this difference which exists between fundamental right and human right is very, very important when we have to test the legislative action or the executive action and examine their validity.
This is by Jay Selvaram. Whenever I raise reasonable points showing the fundamental facts were not established at the time of bail under NDPS Act, almost all judges say that these are matter of trial and not for bail. What is your take on this?
Now, so far as bail is concerned, under the NDPS Act, we have certain rigorous conditions which are applicable where the contraband is commercial or quantities commercial in nature, or the offences under section 19 and 27A of the Act. Now, so far as at the stage of grant of bail, only the broad probabilities of the case are to be examined. Now, let us suppose that in a given situation, in a case under the NDPS Act, Section 50, search was conducted in contravention of Section 50 of the Act. Now, this contravention can be definitely taken note of even at the stage of considering the bail application by the court. So it is not so that in all situations the violation of this procedural prescription will not be taken note of at the stage of bail and will be examined only at the stage of trial. So that depends. But let us take a situation where there are few points being raised by the accused that Section 57 was not adhered to properly, or there was certain violation of non-mandatory provisions. Then definitely the court may refuse to take those into consideration at the stage of considering the bail application and relegate the accused to see its effect at the end of the trial.
Avinash, is concept of victim compensation even before the trial has started valid according to the Constitution? Doesn't it encourage false cases under Section 498 and 376?
No, we cannot simply say that there is a potential or possibility of a misuse of a given provision, and therefore it should be it can be unconstitutional. Now, so far as the victim compensation is concerned, it is again an evolving concept under our jurisprudence. Since victim has to be compensated, I may also share with you that when this Prevention of Corruption Act was amended in 2018, based upon the UN Convention against Corruption of 2005, under the convention, there was a provision that the victims of corruption should also get compensation. There should be a mandatory provision in the domestic laws of the of the member countries that the victim of corruption should also get compensation at the hands of the courts. But this was not incorporated. So as of now, the court can only fall back upon the provision of CRPC, the codal provision 357, etc., in order to grant the compensation to the victim of corruption. Now, so far as the question is concerned, grant of compensation to the victim is rather one of the facets of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. The victim who has suffered and the state who is obligated to protect the commission of the offences against the general public, it is under obligation to compensate the victim. So therefore, in no situation we can say that the grant of compensation to the victim can fall foul of the constitutional scheme.
This is by Shivam. What is the difference between damages and compensation?
Now the word, so far as damages is concerned, we normally imply this concept under the law of tort as well as under the law of contract. Damages in general term simply means that if there is a legal obligation, maybe contractual or legal, to perform, and its violation is resulted in some loss to the person, then those damages are to be quantified in terms of money and given to the that party. Now, so far as compensation is concerned, it may overlap with the damages part. It means to compensate the person for any loss, for any, we can say, contravention of the fundamental right or any legal right. So therefore, essentially, this is the primary difference between the two, but these concepts will definitely overlap. That is the damages and the compensation.
Naveen Kumar says CRPC has a definition of victim, which means one who has suffered loss or injury. Complainant is not an always victim. It should be established in court that complainant has suffered loss or injury. Suffered before terming him as a victim. What is your take on this?
The reason is that under the criminal law, anybody can set the criminal law in motion. So complainant can be anybody. Suppose I have witnessed a crime being committed on a public street and I lodge the FIR or the complaint with the police. So I may be the complainant, but still I am not the victim who has suffered the loss on account of the commission of that particular offense. So therefore, the complainant and the victim obviously can be separate individuals under the criminal law, and that is the reason that why only the victim are entitled to the compensation. So the complainant can also be the victim, but he may not be so.
Presumption, this is by Ramkumar, presumption of innocence remains intact or not if person is convicted and he has appealed to the higher court.
Now, so far as the appeal is concerned, once he is convicted, the presumption of innocence will not remain. In the appeal, it is the appellant who has to establish that the judgment of the trial court was erroneous. Therefore, this presumption of innocence will not extend before the appellate court.
This is, can a petitioner file an application under section 91 of CRPC, but should not be allowed? Please mention, what is your take on section 91?
91 CRPC?
Yes.
Now, so far as 91 CRPC is concerned, I can just refer to the provision also, because the question is a bit vague in the sense that petitioner in what kind of cases will be able to file this.
Probably he's taking cue that he had attended one of Bharat Chug's, wherein he had moved, he said that you can move an application for the mobile tower location, etc. So
Yes,
at that point of time also he had raised this question.
Yes, that can be done. So far as 91 is concerned, it deals with summons to produce document or other thing. Now, before I refer to this provision, I must say that the Honorable Apex Court has held that this provision will not be applicable to accused. So therefore, the investigating officer or the court cannot ask the accused under 91 to produce the documents which are incriminating in nature. But so far as the other parties are concerned in criminal trials, that is the accused also, the prosecution also, the investigating officer also, they can definitely file the application under 91 CRPC for production of documents. In NDPS cases, it is very, very common that the moment the charge sheet is submitted or challan is submitted, or even before that, Section 191 application is filed by the accused for preserving the tower location and the mobile phone details and etc. of the police party who has effected the search and seizure, as well as the accused. So this application we find often before the trial courts.
Sir, could you elaborate the context, section 304B and 306, slightly on an elaborate sense?
Now 306 deals with the abetment to suicide offense. Probably these are the IPC offenses. And 304B relates to dowry death. Now, so far as in the context of reverse burden clause, I've already said that 113A and 113B of the Indian Evidence Act raises the presumption. 113A is the example of permissive presumption, that is, it is not obligatory on the court to raise the presumption. And 113B is the example of obligatory presumption, that where there is no option with the court, but the court will raise the presumption, which is mentioned there. Now, in all the two presumption or reverse burden clauses, the law has laid down that so far as the foundational fact, for example, if we read 306 IPC, we will come to know what are the ingredients of this offense. If we examine 304B, that is the offense of dowry death, we will come to know what are the ingredients of the offense of 304B. Now the reverse burden clauses, corresponding reverse burden clauses attached to these under 113A and 113B simply says that if out of these all the ingredients, certain ingredients are proved by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt, then the remaining ingredients shall be presumed by the court. So therefore, it lightens the burden of the prosecution and reverses the burden upon the accused to disprove all these facts.
This is by Mohan Singh. So victim was added by amendment in the CRPC in the year 2009. My question is under section 372 proviso. Does victim has a right in the complaint case and if required leave of High Court or not? I think he will have to read the judgment of the Justice Suryakant.
No, thereafter we have some judgments of the
Supreme Court also.
Also on the
so
same
principally point. The judgment of the Tatas was adopted.
Yes.
Not adopted. Those same principles had been followed.
Some part of it was modified. So probably I'll give the citation also, relevant citation in this regard, and I'll request Mr. Vikas to circulate the same in the
circulate all the judgments which you have cited, like
yes.
And
I can cite this. I can give this judgment also, and the concerned participant can go through the same. Now, so far as the appeal part is concerned, so far as victim is concerned, even if he is a complainant, he can definitely file an appeal, and the Honorable Apex Court has now held that there is no need to seek the leave to appeal if the victim and the complainant are the same. So therefore, so far as victim is concerned, there is no requirement even in complaint cases to seek leave to appeal because 372 proviso, which provided the right of appeal to the victim, stand on a different footing. So I can probably give the judgment also on the same. You can go through the same.
We will take a question from the Facebook. It says by Adala Venkata Satyanarayana. In POSCO case, the victim is a minor girl and she deposed under section 164 CRPC. But she was not presented before the court during the trial, nor shown as a witness. She deposed nothing about either the incident or about the accused. However, mother and father had deposed in case. How do we deal in such a situation? Minor's mother is a de facto complainant.
All right. Now, if this is a situation, then definitely, if from the testimony of the mother and father, the accused is able to rebut the presumption of section 29 and 30, then definitely he can seek the acquittal. Now, as I've already said, that so far as this reverse burden clauses, even under the POCSO Act is concerned, these are not irrebuttable presumptions. These are rebuttable. And I will also share that as a judge, whenever we examine a case at the end of the trial, whatever evidence has come on the record, it is again the probability factor which plays a bigger role in the mind of the judge to find out whether the allegation in a given case stands proved, or they are shaky, or they are not proved on the record. So ultimately, who led the evidence, who gave the evidence at the end of trial, it almost becomes immaterial. And the entire focus is whether whatever evidence is on the record, whether this gamut of evidence prove all the ingredient of the given offense or not. So in this situation, my take is that he can definitely show to the court from the testimony of the witnesses whoever have deposed that the presumption of 29 and 30 stand rebutted, and the case of the prosecution is not proved.
We will take the last question and then we will ask certain insights, since you have been quite successful on the judicial part. So not exactly how to crack the exam, but we will ask how to juxtapose all the statutes and law while dealing as a lawyer, or how to remember it and put it across. This is by Akash Sahu. This is the last question on the platform. Will logic of reverse burden apply on all genders, or is it applicable on men only?
No, reverse burden clauses are gender neutral. So depending upon the offense and the corresponding reverse burden clause, those will be attracted. So it has got nothing to do with the gender as such. But if the offense itself is gender specific, like in sexual assault cases, then obviously the corresponding reverse burden clause would also go along with the same offense.
Before I will take two questions, I've just received the message from Bharat Chugh, who is also an erudite speaker and people follow him. He says, kindly convey, it is a super inform. He had to leave the platform. He says it was a super informative session. Convey this to Mr. Sra.
I thank Mr. Chugh also. He himself is an erudite speaker, and I had the opportunity to watch one or two of his webinars. So he definitely speaks remarkably on these subjects.
I'm reminded, though from the historic, they said, Horus asked how you should be treated. He says king should be treated like a king. So if a king asks tells the other king that he's also good, that gives you more sense of at least something to thump about. Not to be proud of,
that, but
but not.
But all I say, I share my whatever little insight I have.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Given subject.
The insights only give the flip to the entire this thing.
I will just ask the expert on the same.
I will just ask, like we have also seen today, wide spectrum of law being discussed about, though the topic itself is presumption, and which itself is a wider connotation. What is your take and advice to the participants who are watching us live on the Facebook, or those who will watch us on our YouTube channel of Beyond Law CLC, or those who are being as a participant on this platform? How do you assimilate all these acts? What is your advice to them, that how should you assimilate the facts, and how do you correlate that this particular section from the Indian Evidence Act or this from particular act and statute can be juxtaposed so that the complainant or the accused can sail through better? Or let's assume for CPC also, how do you basically correlate with them? How do you It's law is more like a jigsaw puzzle, or what we used to say Rubik cube. How do you actually put them straight in a straight jacket formula?
Now, Mr. Vikas, though there is no hard and fast formula for all this, so hard work is definitely one of the first key element, I would say. When you start reading extensively on a given subject, you definitely start correlating all these. But I would say the first step which the youngsters can take in this direction is that while reading any provision of law, like for example, they are reading any provision of the Indian Penal Code, they must try to correlate that how this given provision, if it is a substantive provision, how this will be procedurally dealt with. Like one example I can give you, that while studying the trial processes under the CRPC, we find that they are given in a systematic way. The trial of a session by the session court, warrant cases trial, this and that, those fall in a seriatim order in the provisions. But one of the key provisions, that is section 313 CRPC, which relates to the examination of the accused after the prosecution has led the evidence, it finds place at the end of the code. So when the student would be reading this procedure, that is the criminal trial process or procedures, if he reads literally these provisions, he will definitely miss the stage of 313 CRPC. But if we try to correlate these aspects, practically how that these will be dealt with in the code of law, then probably he will be able to correlate all these provisions, maybe from the Indian Evidence Act, maybe from the Criminal Procedure Code, maybe from the Civil Procedure Code. Similarly, it happens in case of CPC also. If a youngster or a student is aware of the stages of a civil trial or a civil case, that how it is going to proceed from step 1 till step end, then probably he will be able to correlate all the provisions under the CRPC and can apply at each stage of the same. Like if he knows that the case is going to start by a presentation of the plaint, and then broadly summons will be issued to the defendant will appear, he will put in the written statement. Then replication can also come, though there is no specific provision regarding that, the same. And then the court can adopt any of the alternate dispute resolution methods. And if it is not adopted, framing of issues, then leading of plaintiff evidence, then defendant evidence, so on and so forth, then rebuttal evidence. So probably then he'll be able to correlate each and every provision of the law at each and every stage. So therefore, my advice is that they should correlate the law with its practical application. Once that is done, then all this puzzle will fall into order. They'll be able to correlate by and large most of the provision. Now, second point is that if whenever they read any judgment of any court, they should read it in detail. They should not confine themselves to the head note of the same. So when they will read the entire judgment, they will be again able to correlate different provisions which are handy or which are applicable to given situation. So probably these are the few intakes I can share with the participant. Rest all I say, it's all hard work. Once they start going about the same, they'll be able to catch out of nitty-gritty, how to go about this, how to correlate this. Like in case of reverse burden clause, when I was preparing the topic, so I was able to compare the clauses in these 4 acts, that is the NDPS Act, Prevention of Corruption Act, Negotiable Instrument, and POCSO. So the POCSO provision, I found that this is different from the other 3 provisions. The language employed is different. and so how the court interpreted the same. So therefore, probably by this automatically these things can come to the mind once you start doing this research work in all this.
So you mean to say that the difference between any successful person is hardworking and hardly working?
That's true. Hard work is going to pay a lot.
Do you personally feel that you have always taught, etc., like since they are young students and some children also, they personally feel that he's too lucky? Do you feel that somebody can actually do very, very well, at least in the academics, without studying? Not without studying, meaning thereby vis-a-vis, it can't be. Because for that, I always believe the physics principle. They say work is equal to force into distance. So if distance is not traveled, so anything into 0 is 0. But I'm talking of something as to whether there is something like anybody who says that this lawyer doesn't study at all, but he's only based upon the fortune luck.
So I can, Mr. Vikas, I can only share my own personal experiences. I was an average student and I am an average student. So far as I am concerned, it is only the hard work which has paid me. So I cannot subscribe to the principle that without hard work, anybody can achieve something or can go far in the profession. Especially in our profession where hard work is the key and there is no shortcut to success. So probably I will not advise that without studying, without doing any hard work, one will be able to achieve. So one can achieve some superficial knowledge, but then there will be no depth in that.
So you have clarified that what people might think, Srada bada lucky hai, jiti har bari crack kar jande paper.
It's only the hard work. It's only the hard work which is going to pay, not anything else.
Okay. And the last question we will ask, since it's not though of the examination, but invariably people say that when Mr. Bharat comes or Mr. Sra comes, what is your advice that how should they prepare the notes or how should they go about? The syllabus sector is too vast. I'm just taking the insights for a young lawyer or the students of law who intend to take a judicial examination. What should be their key into that?
I'll only say two principles are handy in preparation of any examination. One is simplification, and second is conciseness. So if you are able to simplify the complex concepts and prepare concise notes on that, those will always be handy. So instead of preparing long notes, gathering, we can say, umpteen judgments, those will not be helpful. So my advice is that simplification, that is one. Once there is simplification, there will be a clarification also. So if we simplify the complex concepts, we will be able to understand that what these concepts are, what are the various nuances of these concepts. We can handle different areas in that very concepts. And second is conciseness, because in examination, we don't have much time to write the answers and all that. So if our notes are concise, then probably we are able to put in more in our answers, because otherwise somebody having so much in his mind will be beating about the bush, and that is not advisable.
So how to clutter that entire mind and get it simplified?
Simplification obviously will come again from the hard work. You keep on, you read the concept once, you read it second time, third time, fourth time. Definitely you'll find that it is simplified.
So for today, besides the topic, we had we took the leverage of Mr. Sra to give the insights, which invariably people do post me that kindly have their insights to the effect that how should one do the examination? What is the way forward?
So only formula, Mr. Vikas, is we can convey to them is hard work. Nothing but hard work.
Okay. So, one of the insights which you have given to us is that, as we say, that the picture is a short that is called PIC, pick, as young people all on the social media, etc. share. So, according to you, the pick word would be precise, concise, and concise. That for any formula to be successful. So, the pick actually meant that. Thank you for sharing that insight. Tomorrow, we will be having a webinar on auctions and sale of properties under the SARFAESI Act, because auctions and sales invariably keep on bothering the minds of a lawyer or a common man as to what are the provisions and what is the provisions and what are the way forward, whether the auction can be cancelled, etc. Tomorrow, we will be having Ananda Gomti Murgusen, an advocate from Madras High Court who specializes in the auction proceedings as well as the SARFAESI. Do connect tomorrow at 6 p.m. in our endeavor and pursuit to continue the webinars. And Mr. Sra, as usual, you were spot on. And now we can all understand why the spotlight is on you when you come to share your knowledge, not only on this platform, but other platforms also. We are quite enamored by the fact that you have been accepting our invites, and we are also thankful to the Chandigarh Judicial Academy, wherein whenever we shoot down the mail to the effect that kindly allows that Mr. Sra should give his insights, they have been kind enough to allow one of the faculty members to share his insights, not only for Chandigarh, but pan-India, and that is what we have always been believing, that sharing is caring. To all the participants who have been watching us on the Facebook, YouTube, and the present platform, we are thankful to all of you. Those who have not subscribed to us on the WhatsApp or on the YouTube, they can do that so that they can have the peep-in of all the webinars which we have uploaded on the YouTube channel of Beyond Law CLC. Everyone, stay safe, stay blessed, and our special thanks not only to all the participants who participated, and also to Mr. Bharat Chugh and Justice Kuldeep Singh, who were kind enough to come out from the busy schedule to have the peep. That gives us an extra flip to do better and better. As what Mr. Srad said, that the hard work is only the key to success. We only believe that we should continue with the pursuit so that people can actually gain during these testing times. Stay safe, stay blessed. Namaskar. And thank you, Mr. Srad, once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.